Okay, hey, so The Price is Right. Welcome. Got my little Phil Donahue mic here, Jason. All right, I'm Doug Seefeld from History Department, and I'm also the Research Director for the DSL. I want to welcome you all here, along with my colleague Jim Connolly, who's the Faculty Director for the DSL. We also work with Matthew Shaw, the Dean of the Library, is also a co-director, and Brad Faust, here, who's our technical director. And then you may know John Philwalk from IDIA. He's the design director. So we've been just started in January putting this together, as you know, many of you know, and we're excited for this, our third feed of the semester. Glad we could provide lunch and that you could take the time to come. So what we're going to do today is have about a half-hour presentation from Jason Heppler, who is the digital engagement librarian and also an assistant professor of history at the University of Nebraska-Omaha. And he is a digital historian who began his path that career path as a master's student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln when I had the pleasure to work with him in my digital history courses. And he, from that very beginning, he was creating digital components and using digital tools to research his master's thesis on Native American protest movements in the post-war years and the media coverage of them. And then he went on and did his dissertation, which is what he's going to be here next week to give a presentation on that topic. Don't let industry do its business in our water, urban space, and environmental politics in Silicon Valley. That's on the flyer that's in front of you. That's next Wednesday evening, right next door, or just over there in room 104. But he's also going to join us next Thursday afternoon for a hands-on workshop to actually do the kind of stuff he's going to show and talk about at the feed today. So if you're interested and haven't signed up for the workshop, let us know before you leave today. The spaces are limited in size. It'll be in this room, and Jason will be standing right here instead of on the screen, and you will be able to hear him just fine, I'm sure.
I hope so.
Yeah. So we're looking forward to that. So today's objective is to introduce you to a handful of work that's out there that Jason either worked on or he knows about. Oh, I should say he went while he was ABD at Nebraska. He got a position at Stanford University where he was working in a couple different groups over there as a digital humanist who was one of them. He was assigned to the history department as a liaison between the digital humanities work that's going on at Stanford and the faculty and grad students there. And another one, he's working at the spatial history lab. And all kinds of stuff. Really great learning opportunities. And he just took his position at Omaha in the library in January. So we're real excited to have him here for this today. And we'll have time for Q&A at the end for sure. So and feel free to finish your lunch. And we'll turn it over to Jason. Welcome.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me. You can still hear me okay, I hope. Let's see. I'm going to try to share my screen before we go too far. Okay. Can you see my screen? Yes. Okay, good. Good. Well, again, thanks for Jim and Doug for inviting me to come yak at you all for a little bit while you eat lunch. I'm looking forward to being there next week and doing some hands-on stuff with some of this. What I wanted to do today, and if there's any audio issues, just let me know, and we'll try to fix it. But what I want to do today is talk a little bit about networks and just a little bit about what they are and where they come from, but we'll mostly spend some time looking at how people have been using networks in their research and spend some time thinking about them just a little bit. I'm going to try to keep this to 30 minutes, and then we can kind of talk about it afterwards. But for starters, it's worth pointing out that formal networks as we use them today, like the crazy one you see on the right side of the screen right now, are mathematical instantiations of an idea that entities and connections exist between them. So graph theory, social network analysis, network science, and related fields mostly have a history that date about to the 18th century. And the idea that relationships are essential to understanding the world is rather ancient. We can find the use of trees in networks stretching back to Assyrian iconography in northern Iraq, some dating to 865 BC. Or we could look at the work here of the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher. The tree here symbolizing 10 pulses or emanations of divine energy. And of course, it's not just the realm of religion. Science uses networks as well. Charles Darwin uses networks to illustrate his evolutionary thinking in theory of universal common descent. So networks really have a broad range of purposes. Scientific understanding, historical inquiry, even ways to explain the divine. But the use of formal network theory is much more recent, probably only emerging in the last 40 to 50 years. So we're going to look at a few examples of these more recent examples. And I'll apologize to the room. I don't know exactly who's all here, but I'll be leading on a few examples from the discipline of history, but I hope you'll see that theories of network science are quite interdisciplinary. Certainly network science doesn't emerge in the field of history. It's borrowed from the social sciences, and so there's a lot of overlap between the kind of things that go on here in network science. Excuse me. This network here is perhaps the most well-known and at this point a classic study by John Paget and Christopher Ansel in 1993. And these scholars were using networks to build a historical hypothesis about the Medici family and their rise to power in Florence. So the authors are connecting just under 100 families in 15th century Florence. These are all elite families, and they've identified 9 kinds of relationships between these families, which includes family ties, economic partnerships, patronage relationships, and friendships. And the analysis here revealed to them that the Medici family, by design and sometimes by accident, managed to isolate other Florentine families from one another, meaning that the Medici family here acts as kind of a vital connective tissue between the families. If one of these other families, for example, wants to reach, let's say, I don't know, one of the families here in the northern part of the network, or upper part of the network, northern, wanted to talk to someone in the bottom left, they have no direct connection there, but one way to get there is to work with somebody in the Medici family. So because of this sort of central place that the Medici family is in, this particular family acts as a, they have a deciding vote in almost every situation that comes up. And it's in part this position in the network that gives this family this rise to power that lasts for 300 years. Now, before the age of the internet, networks are probably top of mind for people studying kinship and genealogical networks. So think of even your own family trees. This is a kind of network, ties between family members. And while those kind of methods have been around for a long time, the application of social network theory is much more recent. So looking here at kinship networks in Southwest Germany in the early 19th century, Carola Lipp in 2005 explored whether the addition of an electoral system affected the system of kinship, which had previously guided the structure of power in communities. In other words, does the imposition of an electoral system undercut kinship power and make things more democratic, is Lipp's core research question here. There's a series of graphs like this in her work, so I'd urge you to go look at the article if you want to know more about her conclusions. But surprisingly, Lipp finds that a half century of elections did not reduce kinship power and, in fact, strengthen these kinship ties. So Lip is using these networks to reveal how prominent actors in local political factions connected to other important individuals. Then all the while managing to maintain their power. Primarily, this has to do with, again, position in the network. If somebody in the upper right wants to have some kind of political connection to someone in the bottom left, there's no direct connection, but there are people that they can go through to get there. And there are certain actors within these networks that either have lots of connections, so they might have many, many people that they connect to, or on the other hand, they might be a central actor in the sense that they connect a lot of different people together, right? So to get from one part of the network to the other, you have to go through maybe a handful of people. Transportation and trade networks, another significant way of looking at these network systems. And looking here at the voyages of the East India Company between 1601 and 1833, Emily Erickson and Peter Behrman in 2006 tried to show how a globalized economy formed from ship captains who were seeking out profits, seeking profit out of the malfeasance of private trade. So the authors here are using networks as evidence. They're linking together some 26,000 ports and finding that over the course of 200 years, as more ports are connected to one another, the East India Company loses control. So again, we're looking here at networks as an understanding of political power and the way that it's either formed or undercut by actors within a network. Now, the downside to these three previous examples is that they're static. These all appear in print publications, and there's no real way for the reader or even for the researchers to come into these networks, explore them interactively, look at these networks on their own. But the good news is that it's fairly simple to get an interactive web-based network going. And we'll talk about how to do this next week, but we're going to look at just a couple here right now. And I'll pull these up to look at more closely. So we'll start here. And I want to point first to the work of Ryan Cordell and David Smith at Northeastern University, who are using networks to track the spread of news in the 19th century. In particular, they're trying to look at how pieces of text were reprinted across newspapers. So viral texts is a large-scale study about how information spread through what was really the social media outlet of its day. This project in particular is drawing on the Library of Congress's Chronicling America database. So I think right now it stands around 500 newspapers, something like 2.7 million pages at this point. And what they're hoping their network will help them do is follow how often pieces are republished across newspapers in the 19th century. Really with what seems like a pretty simple question, which is, how does text go viral? And so we think of viral as a sort of 21st century phenomenon, but it actually has a history, and it's here in the 19th century. The work that they're doing here is probably being built, or is most certainly being built, in a tool called Gephi. We'll look at Gephi next week. And so the data preparation is probably happening outside of Gephi, but once data comes in, they're visualizing their networks. They're doing all this coloring work, which in this case indicates, I believe, newspapers that frequently republish one another's works. But they're putting all this into Gephi, getting the visualizations built, getting the data ready, and exporting that as a web-based file that they can serve up. So if we actually look at this here, everybody see this okay? So this is the network. It does have one vital sin, which is that we sometimes refer to this as the spaghetti problem. And what we're looking at is an extremely dense network that's extremely hard to interpret because there's a lot going on and it looks like a ball of mess. But the nice thing about this is it is interactive. So if we want to look at the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer, if I mouse off of this, you'll see the colors are everywhere. But if I move over one of these, I can see very specifically the connections that that newspaper has to these other newspapers. Any newspaper that doesn't have some direct connection fades out. So it's a cleaner look at what's going on within the network. And clicking on this also gives me some extra information. There's some statistics going on here, which I'll save for next week. But also the kind of connections or the connections that the newspaper has to other newspapers. Are things being printed in other papers that originate from the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer, that's the outgoing, or are there things that the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer is reprinting from other newspapers, that's the incoming. And so we can actually click on any one of these also and see where they're at, see more information about these things. There's an incredible amount of data within the project. Still ongoing, so there's a lot of work to be done. You can also search Wheeling. Sometimes might be too big. Anyways. Another project that's still in its early days, I think, is OSE Can You See, which is a project at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. This is being led by Will Thomas, Jen Giuliano, and Trevor Munoz. The project is exploring multi-generational Black, white, and multiracial family networks in early Washington, D.C. And the way that they're capturing this information is through thousands of case files from circuit court records, state courts, and the Supreme Court, which includes petitions for freedom, as well as civil, criminal, and chancery cases, plus any related documents within archives and special collections. As the state is digitized, the project is inferring relationships between every individual within a legal record to make visible the history of slavery, including networks among free and enslaved peoples. So the idea here is to try to think about slavery just a little bit differently. Most historians tend to ascribe slavery to a system, or more recently, an exploitative feature of capitalism. But what this project also is trying to do is argue for slavery's individual actions and movements through time and space. So far, the project has uncovered 10,146 different relationships. But they estimate by the end of this, they'll have roughly around 240,000 relationships. And so what we're looking at here for Mary Queen are familial, legal, social, and other kinds of relationships that she has to other people in these court cases, in these court records. All these individuals can be interacted with. You can click on these names, see their connections. You can also read more details about these people's lives. So, oops. So this is an example of the project. This is Richard Beard. Richard has some descriptive information that they've culled out of the court cases. There are the actual cases or related cases themselves that you can come look at, as well as full transcriptions of the documents themselves and scans of those documents. And an expression of the kinds of relationships that, in this case, Richard Beard has with other people that are mentioned within these documents. And we can visualize these by coming into here and seeing the kind of connections that he has to other people related to those court cases. There could be other people petitioning for freedom. It could be family members who are included in the case. There could be legal structures, other attorneys, and so on that they're connected to. And all of this is interactive as well, so we can click on a name here, see their connections to people, see his connection to Richard, who's, in this case, I guess, a neighbor. We can also click on James Carol and refreshed the network to see it centered on James. There's a lot going on here. I'm not exactly sure how they're building this. The text end of it is certainly probably XML and a lot of stuff going on underneath. The network itself, I'm not sure how they're building it. I think it's a custom platform. I've not seen anything like this quite before. But I think it's a very ambitious project, and it's something to keep an eye on. Not all networks, however, are trees. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes networks are trade routes or transportation routes. And at Stanford University, Walter Scheidel, who's a professor in the classics department, and Elijah Meeks, who for a while was the digital humanities specialist in the libraries at Stanford, have represented transportation networks in the Roman world. Now, this interactive network does a lot. So, if you want to get from Constantinople to Rome in the spring, using roads or rivers on the cheapest route by riding a donkey, we can find out how long that would take, we can find out how much that would cost, and the duration or the distance of the trip. I love this project. Has anybody else in the room seen this? No? It's probably the most trafficked site out of Stanford right now. So this is Orbis, and let's say we want to go from Constantinople to go to Rome. So we go in the spring. We'll take the cheapest route. We'll stick to the roads and the rivers, and we'll go by wagon. Now, we calculate this route. This will take just a second. This is kind of like GPS for the ancient world. It's great. So here's our route that we would take. This is the cheapest route. The fastest route, it probably takes us around the boot of Italy. We get some statistics here about how long it would take, how many kilometers it would cover, how much it would ship to cost wheat by donkey, wagon, and passenger carriage, as well as some latitude, longitude perspective, the length of the trip, distance of the trip, and some comparisons in cost, how many denarii it would take to ship these things. It's an ambitious project, and it's easy to lose an entire afternoon in this, so I urge you to check it out. There's a lot going on here. Lots of places, lots of different routes that are calculated within this. One thing to bear in mind with this particular network, though, is that it's a model of a transportation network. So although much of the information here is grounded in historical research, there's also a fair bit of assumptions going on within this network. We don't actually know if these are the real routes. In some cases they are, but we don't always know. But nevertheless, it's a remarkable project. So not all networks are trees. They also aren't always networks like this. We can represent network data in different visual forms, and we'll talk a little bit more about this next week. But here's an example using an arc. So the Bible Cross-Reference Project by Chris Harrison, who's a designer and an artist, may not look like a network, but it is an expression of relationships and connections. So here, Harrison is looking at the visualizing the textual cross-references in the Bible, looking at some 63,000 cross-references in total. You'll note the bar chart along the bottom of the graph, which represents all of the chapters in the Bible. So each bar is a Bible chapter. And the length of the bar denotes the number of verses within that chapter. Cross-references are noted by the arc, and color corresponds to the distance between the chapters. So blues and purples and lighter blues are much closer to each other in reference. The greens and the yellows and the browns are much further apart. It's almost like a kind of citation network, and it's an interesting way to try to represent what is essentially still network data, just without the tree. I don't have a good explanation of how he made this, I'm sure there's some programs out there that would do it, but there's nothing off the shelf that I know of that could do this. And while we're on the subject of text, we can look at the work of Martin Grandjean. Grandjean here has visualized character interactions in all of Shakespeare's tragedies. So in this case, the larger the node, the greater number of interactions that that character has with other characters in the plays. And you'll also note that Grandjean is doing some network calculation. You'll notice that number to the right called network density. I'm going to pause real briefly here and explain what this is. What network density is trying to measure is the number of potential connections versus the number of actual connections. Potential connections, for example, could exist between two nodes even if there's no actual connection. Person A might know person B, but they may not actually connect in any meaningful way. So an example might be at a family reunion where most people have actual connections. Network density would be very high, even maybe 100%, because you know each other and have real connections and relationships with people. But network density on, say, a public bus would be much lower, where there might be potential connections, but the odds of an actual relationship is much, much lower. I won't go any deeper into that. We'll talk more about these network statistics next week. But anyway, the point being, it's not just about historical data or events or relationships. There are other ways that we can represent, say, literature and draw conclusions about those things. And then I got to return to Stanford again. This is Stanford University's Mapping the Republic of Letters project, which is probably one of the most well-known examples of this kind of work. And what the team is trying to analyze here is correspondence networks in the Enlightenment. The world of scholarship, the world of information, the way knowledge is disseminated, and how that happens through correspondence, letters that are sent to and from different people. Here we're looking at letters sent to and from Locke and Voltaire. And they're motivated, by a few questions, which is, how extensive is this network actually? Historians tend to think it's pretty broad, but maybe it's not. And there are ways that we can visually represent what that network might look like and how dense that network actually is. But also, just as important, is how that network changes over time. So the Republic of Letters is using various case studies, Voltaire, Benjamin Franklin, D'Alembert, Galileo, Kircher, and others, to understand how these networks look and form. They don't have a lot of visuals up, but we can look at one real quick. Excuse me, if we look at Voltaire, there's some description here about what's going on. I can say about this map, the one we were just looking at, this one, I believe, was one of their earliest attempts to do some kind of analysis on the correspondence. This one, if I remember right, emerged from a collaboration with a design school and some students in a class, and so they partnered up with another professor to try and build something and design something that would allow them to visualize these networks. It was moderately successful to build this. One of the big problems that the students had and the project more generally is that there's a lot of missing date information or location information for these letters, which means that there was a lot of data thrown out. And of course, that's going to skew the visual results that you get in the network. And so, although I think this was a useful way for them to look at some of these things, there were some limitations to the way that they could understand it. They've done a little bit more work on this. This is a project called INK. INK is, I don't believe it's available for use beyond mapping the Republic of Letters, but we'll talk about a tool next week that does some similar things. But again, this is Voltaire's correspondence network. Each of these nodes, in this case, are an author. There's some destination. There's some source for that letter, who it was sent to, and so on. And I think this links out to the letter, the text of the letter itself. And there's some statistical information down here. There's a bar chart. There's a what this is called a Sankey diagram. This is also network data. Just looks very different from a tree or an arc. Some different ways to kind of explore the kind of correspondence that Voltaire is is doing. So that's a super quick overview of some networks and a few projects. And of course, if you're interested in a sneak peek of the workshop for next week, you can follow the link there at the bottom. Or if you can't make it, maybe the link will help you get started. But yeah, that's it.
All right, thank you, Jason.
Sure.
It's spot on time too. Excellent, good job.
Good.
All right, so I meant to mention earlier that there's a flyer in front of you. Please hang it up back in your department. It'd be great. If you would like a PDF to circulate, just drop me an email. I'll get it to you, or Jim. And we appreciate your helping us get the word out about his public talk next Wednesday. If you want to, you'll see the same kind of work, but it'll be his work on Silicon Valley. He'll show some of his visualizations as well. I know some of you have to leave to get to a 1 o'clock class or something else. So if those of you would like to ask the first questions, then we can all stay after a little bit, if those of us who can. So I'll come to you with the mic so we can record your question. Put up your hand. Don't make me call on you. All right, over here.
I can't see the room, so you don't have to worry about me
okay.
begging on you.
I can fix that.
Hi, Jason. Pat Collier from the English department. I'm hoping to be able to see you next week. I just want to see if I'm right about this. So I assume that these you're showing us the final or the latest, sort of status of these projects right now. Am I correct in assuming that there's a really gigantic range of labor that's gone into actually data entry and things like that? I mean, I assume that some of these, the manipulation of the data is more or less automatic because you have you sort of have a pre-existing data set, where in other cases you actually have people entering data for hours and hours. Is that right?
Yeah. So my rule of thumb for most projects, whether it's networks, whether it's spatial history or maps, or any form of digital history stuff or digital scholarship, about 80% of your time is going to go towards preparing the data. The visualization part is pretty easy. We have the tools to do it. But in a lot of cases, the data prep is going to take usually quite a bit of time. I mean, the Mapping the Republic of Letters project has been going on since, gosh, I don't know, 2005 maybe. So they've been working on that stuff for sure over 10 years at this point. And it's a big project, so there's lots of people involved, historical people as well as researchers. But I mean, the short answer is yes. There is quite a bit of labor that goes into preparing the data, and with some network data, and we'll talk about a little more about this next week. But the data prep it can be extremely tedious. There's a lot that has to go on, but there's a payoff at the end. At least you hope. So there's a lot of labor that goes into most of these things. I mean, I think viral text has only been around for maybe 4 years or 5 years, and they've done a tremendous amount of work. But they're also working from, Library of Congress metadata. They're not generating much of that from scratch. And I think there's a fair bit of machine learning going on to do as much automatic work as they can. But I know Ryan works with a lot of grad students also to get the data ready and cleaned up.
Other question? Okay. I think the mic is just picking up the question for the camera, so you still have to speak loudly so he can hear you off my laptop mic.
No problem. I'm an ancient historian, and I'm curious about network mapping changes in certain networks over time. As historians, obviously, we're interested not only in synchronic connectivity, but also diachronic connectivity. So I would be curious about hearing a little more maybe next week, if not necessarily now, about how how changes in networks over time can be represented, especially given that the usual sort of radiating sets of lines tend not to give us that fourth visual dimension of that can show us some ways of changing things over time. And that's a big, broad question, but I don't know whether there are ways to address it that you maybe haven't discussed so much today. Thank you.
So, just to make sure I heard you right, so you're primarily wondering about network changes over time and how we represent that visually.
Correct.
Right. Okay. So there are ways to do it. I'm not totally satisfied with all the ways right now. In part because I think when you start looking at networks and how they change over time, it becomes very difficult to to follow those changes. You know what I mean? So like if there's a relationship that exists at time A, but that no longer exists by time B, I mean the line connecting the two nodes might disappear, but how do you, as the researcher, like effectively follow those changes? It can be really difficult. There is a way, so Gephi, which is the tool we'll look at next week, there is a way to do time series data. So it'll let you kind of march through time, and it'll change the network as you look at it. We'll also look at another tool that's web-based called Palladio. Don't go look at it, wait till next week. I don't want to ruin the surprise. But the nice thing about Palladio is it plays really well with sort of slicing and dicing through your data. And so there's lots of different views that you can get out of the visualizations you're trying to build. So it's not just time series. You could also filter down the network based on locations or gender or any number of things. So you can change the shape of the network while also looking at how it changes over time. Which I guess is maybe an unsatisfactory answer. I mean, there's ways to do it. I'm not totally satisfied with them, but I don't also know what the answer is to really fixing that.
Sure, that might just make it an area of future potential research.
Yeah, absolutely. I know there's a couple of other historians doing this kind of stuff. There's Scott Weingart at Carnegie Mellon, who I think is an early modern historian. He looks at like scientific networks among people. There's also Mickey Kaufman, who I don't know where Mickey is these days, but Mickey has a project called Quantifying Kissinger, which looks at the diplomatic documents of the Nixon administration and Henry Kissinger. And I know she's done some time series network stuff, looking in particular about how interactions are happening, as things change in the Vietnam War or things like that. I think one way she gets around some of this interactive change is she doesn't focus so much on the interactive part. So she'll build a network for like a particular year or a set of years, and then jump to a next year or set of years, build a new network out of it, and try to kind of track changes that way. It's also maybe not ideal, but
reductive but revealing, perhaps.
Yeah.
Hi, Michael Shayevsky with University Libraries. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
My question is, if a library, an academic library, is looking to mobilize in some way to sort of help support faculty members and other researchers in doing this type of research, what are some of the skills, means of support, and sort of software platforms that you think would be good first building blocks to help support or begin to support this kind of activity in a university?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. So certainly there's sort of two tools right now that are sort of the way to do network science work right now. There's Gephi, which, as I mentioned, we'll look at. Gephi's free and open source. Gephi it's inscrutable, but it's incredibly powerful in what it can do. So Gephi is really good. It's a good start. There's also one called Cytoscape, which I believe Cytoscape is built more for the sciences. I know there's a lot of people in biology that use it. I'm not as familiar with Cytoscape. I haven't used it in the past, but I know other digital humanities people and digital scholarship people who do use it and like it, and in some ways prefer it over Gephi. Yeah, so on the tool side, I'd recommend those two things. Otherwise, in terms of like skills and things like that and supporting this stuff, networks, what makes networks hard sometimes is there's sort of two things going on, especially in the discipline of history, which is doing network science is relying on a lot of disciplinary borrowing. And so tools like Gephi and the algorithms and computational tools that are built into it to help you understand networks make a lot of assumptions about data that historians may not share. And so it's good to be aware of some of the limitations that might be present in some of the algorithms. And I mean, even with that, there's a fair number of algorithms available for doing kind of network analysis, and we'll talk more about these next week, but it's good to kind of know what they do. And I'm not saying that people have to, like, you have to know the math to get it right or anything like that, but it is important to know what the algorithm is doing and why. So network density, for example, might be interesting for doing historical analysis, but maybe you're not that interested in potential connections among other nodes. I don't see density used all that often by historians, but you may see things like community detection, which tries to automatically assign communities to nodes within a whole network, which is sort of calculated by the number of dense connections within some part of the network, and then those get colored one color, another part of the network gets colored another color. That would indicate a community tie of some kind. But, you know, kind of being aware of what the algorithms do and then how they work and some of the assumptions behind them is another way to do it. At Stanford, I sort of became the network guy. I didn't really set out to do it. Elijah Meeks left, who was the network guy at Stanford. And when he joined Netflix, we kind of had a hole, and I, in part, filled that along with some of the Republic of Letters folks. And I mean, one of the ways we were doing it there, and one of the ways we're doing it here in Nebraska is some workshops to help teach this stuff and to help people kind of get a grasp on how networks work and what they do and the assumptions that are built into them. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but a few thoughts.
Hi, I'm Jennifer De Silva from the History Department. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Great. I'm still sort of trying to form my question because I can't imagine what the answer is, and that is problematic. So it all begins with the data set. I have been using an Excel sheet, but I'm not happy with that. It's really limiting. What advice can you give for thinking about programs that are better? Any advice is helpful? For data sets that can go in a variety of directions that,
Yeah. I don't know if this is bad news for you, but I can tell you that the mapping of the Republic of Letters folks are still using Excel for everything. And some of those are huge. I mean, some of those spreadsheets are 40,000 lines long, and they're gigantic spreadsheets. You know, in the case of a correspondence network, it's not too difficult, right? So each row, in this case, would represent a letter, and you'd have some column information about who sent it, where it was sent from, who received it, where it was received, some data information, and maybe some other metadata that you might be interested in tracking. I mean, right now, spreadsheets are like the way to do it still. I don't know anybody, for example, that's doing network work and using like relational databases or anything like that. I'm sure they're out there, and I'm sure they exist. But these tools like Gephi and Palladio, I mean, they all interface very well with spreadsheets. That's where it all starts, and they just get imported very easily. And so, I don't know if I have a good answer for you. I mean, it's mostly right now still spreadsheets, as imperfect as that is. You know, there are some ways that you could make the data structure a little bit cleaner, or at least more sane for yourself, which would be like if you're for example recording a lot of place information, you might have a separate spreadsheet that is just there's a column for place names, and then your 2 columns for latitude and longitude, and then in your sort of main spreadsheet, the only thing you would include is place name, and then use a computer to match up the place name of the main table versus the places table. And that way, that's nice, because then you've got this kind of controlled vocabulary and only one thing to fix if there's a problem with the data. But I don't know if that's a good answer.
Thank you anyway.
Sure.
Hi, this is Amanda Herford at University Libraries. I was hoping that you might be able to share some sort of lessons learned that you've encountered along the way, such as small problems that turn into big ones, that it's helpful to know about at the outset.
That's a good question. I don't know if I have any real big problems that I've run into. I think one of the big challenges for beginners of networks is in some ways to kind of understand some of the algorithms or the computational tools that are available and what they can do and what they can't do or what they shouldn't be used as. The other thing that I would think about is Scott Weingart has this great line about how there are many things that can be represented as a network, and there are far fewer things that really should. And what I think Scott is getting at is sometimes it's hard for people to think about some of the limitations of networks. So what I mean by that is it's uncommon and in fact bad practice to mix together like different kind of network entities. So you might, for example, look at, let's say, students and the classes that they take together. Okay, so that network's okay. That's called a bipartite network or a bimodal network. But what you couldn't look at is those students, the classes they took, and their hometowns, and look at those 3 things together inside of a network. One, because the network wouldn't make any sense, but also because the tools that are available for you to actually analyze those things, the algorithms, can't handle n-partite networks. We can't go above 2 distinct entities right now. So there are like computational limitations to some of the things you can do. So occasionally you might run into somebody who's trying to build a data set who is trying to do too much. And you know, what you kind of need to do is basically break that down into 2 different kinds of data sets. So that could be one of the bigger challenges, I suppose, with just the preparation side of it. But.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No? Well, thanks for everybody who came, and if you have any further interest in this, there's a link to a website that Jason set up for the workshop next week. So if you're participating in that, certainly go there and look through that. He's got a section on network literacy. So he talks a little bit about the tools we're going to use. If you're going to do the workshop, you'll want to download, a couple things, or maybe actually you were just mentioning Excel, but aren't you advising that people use a different spreadsheet?
Yes, I forgot to mention that.
Yeah.
Don't use Excel because Excel does things to your data that it should never do. And I would recommend, so for example, when you type in dates, it tries to fix them. I hate that. Don't do that. If you could use like OpenOffice or LibreOffice, I guess it is these days, which is like an open source version of Excel and Word, I would either recommend LibreOffice or if you're on a Mac, Numbers is fine. Google Docs is fine. I haven't had a problem with Google massacring anything.
Yeah.
So I'd stick to one of those three.
And there's links on his website for the workshop to download those. It's the same thing as when you use Microsoft Word. It just puts in a bunch of junk, and so that's why you would use just a plain text editor for text. So same kind of principle. But anyhow, so read up on that. Even if you're not coming to the workshop, there's a good resource there for you to look at. And these are the kind of things that the DSL is going to be involved in with some of the different fellows that we have and over the course of the next year. So on the other side, in the fall maybe, or even into the next spring, we can look forward to some presentations of new network visualizations that we've created here. So this is a first step, and we're happy, and we thank you for joining us in that. And thank you, Jason, and we look forward to seeing you in person
Sure.
next week.
Yeah, thanks.
All right.